When night falls, the small town of Franklin, which appears peaceful during the day, transforms into a place shrouded in unseen horrors. People lock their doors early, streets remain empty, and no one dares to cross the edge of the dark forest. In a forgotten corner of the town, there's one story that has never been openly told, a story about a child who tragically disappeared and whose laughter still echoes to this day. This is where the nightmare begins. A faint laughter, far away at first, grows louder as tiny footsteps follow behind you. Everyone who hears it knows there's no turning back. Those who don't flee immediately will find themselves consumed by unimaginable terror. This is not just a story of death, but of a presence that has never truly left this town. It all began one autumn night, as a thick fog blanketed the small town of Franklin. Sarah, a teenager who had recently moved to town with her family, felt something strange from the moment she set foot in their new home. The house was old, with faded paint and windows that seemed like they hadn't been cleaned in decades. But what made Sarah most uncomfortable was the small garden behind the house. The garden looked long abandoned, with tall wild grass and an old swing that creaked when the wind blew. Sarah froze when she saw the swing gently moving, as if someone had just been playing on it. But there was no one there, only her and the eerie silence. The first day passed quietly, but that night, at exactly midnight, Sarah was awakened by the sound of faint laughter outside her window. It was strange, cheerful yet off. As if something wasn't right with that laughter. She pulled her blanket closer, feeling goosebumps rise on her skin. Slowly, she stepped toward the window, peeking through the gap in the curtains. There was nothing outside. Just the dark garden and the swing, now still. The next morning, Sarah told her mother about what had happened. But her mother simply smiled faintly and said it was probably just a dream. But Sarah knew exactly what she had heard. That night wasn't a dream, it was real. Something was out there. The next night, the laughter returned. This time, it was closer, and when Sarah dared to look out the window, she saw a small figure standing in the garden. A little girl, about 6 or 7 years old, stood with her back to Sarah, wearing a dirty, tattered white dress. The swing beside her creaked softly, as if being pushed by an invisible hand. The little girl stood there, motionless, not moving an inch. Sarah was frozen in place, her heart pounding. Who was this girl? And why was she in their backyard? Suddenly, the girl turned toward Sarah, but her face was obscured in the dim moonlight. Sarah quickly backed away, closed the curtains, and buried herself under the blanket, praying for the laughter to stop. But that night was only the beginning of a nightmare she never could have imagined. The next day, Sarah decided to learn more about the house she now lived in. She went to the town library, searching through old archives about the houses in her new neighborhood. What she found was shocking. The house had once belonged to a family who had lost their young daughter mysteriously 20 years ago. The child, named Emily, had been found dead near the woods behind the garden. Her body was covered in wounds, and to this day, no one knew who was responsible for her death. Emily's death became an urban legend in Franklin, and most of the townsfolk avoided talking about it. But more chillingly, some people claimed they could still hear Emily's laughter at night. Sarah was horrified. Was the girl she saw Emily? Was the spirit of this child still haunting the house, seeking justice for her tragic death? That night, Sarah heard the laughter again. This time, it was accompanied by the sound of small footsteps running outside her room. The footsteps grew closer, stopping right in front of her door. With trembling hands, Sarah slowly walked toward the door. She held her breath, feeling her body freeze in fear. As she touched the doorknob, the laughter stopped. In the suffocating silence, Sarah carefully opened the door. The hallway was dark and empty. There was no one there. But something felt wrong. The air in the corridor was icy cold, far colder than it should have been. And at the end of the hallway, Sarah could barely make out a small shadow darting quickly toward the backyard. Sarah slammed the door shut, ran back to her bed, and cried under the covers. She had no idea what to do. Every night, the laughter came closer, more real. She knew she had to do something before it was too late. Sarah couldn't sleep that night. Every little sound, every creak of the wind passing through the window, made her heart race faster. She didn't know how to explain what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure: Emily was still here. Somehow, the little girl's spirit still lingered, unable to leave the world that had cruelly taken her life. The next morning, Sarah tried to ask her neighbor, an old woman named Mrs. Harper, who had lived in Franklin almost her entire life. When Sarah mentioned Emily, Mrs. Harper's face immediately turned pale. "Never speak of her," Mrs. Harper whispered, her eyes filled with fear. "Emily's death is a wound that has never healed in this town. And those who try to dig into her past, they never find anything but misery." Sarah shuddered at those words. But she didn't give up. Something inside her kept pushing her to dig deeper. There was something terrifying and unseen in this town, and Sarah felt she was already too involved. That night, Sarah decided to be braver. She turned on the lights throughout her room and opened the window, hoping to get a clearer view of the garden behind her house. The swing that always moved at night was now still. There was no wind, and the atmosphere felt eerily quiet. Minutes passed, and nothing happened. Sarah began to think that maybe it was all just her imagination. Maybe she was just too tired or stressed from moving to a new place. But as she was about to close the window, a faint child's laughter echoed again, this time clearer, sharper. Suddenly, Sarah saw something on the ground beneath her bedroom window. Small, wet, muddy footprints led toward the garden. The footprints looked fresh, as if a child had just been running through the damp soil. Sarah felt dizzy, her chest tight with the overwhelming fear. She tried to calm herself, thinking that maybe there were other children around here. But who would be playing in the garden at night? Her bedroom door suddenly creaked open on its own, and Sarah jumped out of bed, torn between wanting to run and her overwhelming curiosity. She slowly approached the open door, cautiously peeking outside. There was nothing in the hallway, but the piercing cold in the air was very real. Sarah decided to follow the footprints. Maybe they would lead her to something that could explain all of this, or at least give her a clue about what to do next. She put on a thick jacket and slowly made her way down to the backyard, following the small tracks that led to the darkest corner near the fence that bordered the woods. The footprints ended there. However, as Sarah bent down to get a closer look, a cold, tiny hand suddenly gripped her ankle. She screamed, falling backward, her body trembling with fear. The laughter returned, this time sounding very close, as if the child was right next to her. In the darkness of the night, Sarah saw something move from behind the trees. Emily's figure, wearing the dirty white dress, became clearer as she approached with slow, deliberate steps. Sarah backed away, feeling her heart race. "Why are you here?" whispered the small voice, soft yet clear in Sarah's ears. It was Emily's voice. And that night, Sarah knew, there was no place that was safe anymore. The next morning, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the previous night. Her body felt weak, exhaustion and fear haunted her every step. Emily's voice, the child's laughter, and the cold grip on her ankle still felt all too real. But Sarah knew she had to act. This was no longer just about fear, it was about uncovering the truth behind the tragedy that had befallen Emily. She couldn't keep living in fear every night without knowing what had truly happened. Sarah felt that if she didn't take the first step, she would become the next victim. She returned to the town library, determined to learn more about Emily's family history. From old, dusty archives, Sarah found an ancient article from a local newspaper about Emily's tragic death. The article described how Emily was found dead at the edge of the woods, her body covered in horrific wounds. There were no eyewitnesses, and at the time, the police could only speculate that Emily had gotten lost and been attacked by wild animals. But something felt strange about the report. It was as if something had been hidden. At the end of the article, it was noted that after Emily's death, her family moved away from Franklin, leaving the house abandoned for years. Some rumors even suggested that Emily's family experienced strange events after their daughter's death, the same laughter, small footsteps at night, and the figure of a little girl wandering around the house. Eventually, they decided to leave town, abandoning all their bitter memories behind. Sarah became more convinced that Emily's spirit had not found peace. There was something unresolved. Maybe someone knew more about this, someone who could help her. She decided to visit an old man known as the local historian, Mr. Bennett. He lived on the edge of town, in an old house that looked like it had never been cared for. Mr. Bennett had lived in Franklin his whole life, and Sarah hoped he could provide answers to this mystery. When Sarah knocked on the door, Mr. Bennett appeared with tired eyes and a wary expression. "I know why you're here," the old man said before Sarah could even speak. "Emily. Her spirit," Sarah whispered. "What really happened to that girl?" Mr. Bennett took a deep breath, as if recalling something long buried. "Emily didn't die because she got lost in the woods," he said in a raspy voice. "There's something darker in this town, something that was never reported. Emily was a victim of something that should never have been uncovered." Sarah stared at Mr. Bennett in horror. "What do you mean?" The old man looked at Sarah with cold eyes. "You should stop searching, child. If not, you'll meet the same fate." That night felt quieter than usual. Cold air seeped into the house through the window cracks, making Sarah shiver. But it wasn't the cold that sent chills down her spine. It was something else, something far more sinister, a creeping sensation that she was being watched. Since her conversation with Mr. Bennett, the tension within her had only grown stronger. The old man clearly knew more than he was letting on, but what he knew about Emily's death remained a mystery. Sarah decided to return home earlier than usual that night. The sky over Franklin had begun to fade into a dark gray, and the small town felt even more ominous. Streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. She quickened her pace, but every footstep she heard behind her made her turn in panic. There was no one there, but the feeling never left that something was following her every move. When she arrived home, Sarah tried to calm herself by making a cup of hot tea, hoping to shake off the strange sensation that haunted her thoughts. But before long, that little giggle returned, this time much closer, as if it came from inside the house. Panicking, Sarah rushed to the kitchen, checking every corner. There was nothing. But the sound continued, growing nearer, and she realized it was coming from the hallway leading to her bedroom. With her heart racing, she slowly made her way toward the hallway, her breath growing heavier. The hallway was dark, lit only by a small, flickering light that cast moving shadows on the walls. At the end of the hall, her bedroom door was slightly ajar, and she could feel the cold air creeping out from within. She knew something was waiting for her in there, something she could no longer ignore. Her footsteps grew heavier, but curiosity and fear intertwined. With trembling hands, she pushed the door open wider, revealing the deepening darkness inside. And there, in the corner of the room, stood the small figure. Emily. Her once white dress was now torn and filthy, her hair disheveled, and her face. Emily's face no longer looked like that of an innocent child. It had transformed into a nightmare, sunken eyes and pale, corpse-like skin, her lips twisted into a terrifying grin. "Help me!" Emily whispered, her voice small yet echoing throughout the room. Sarah held her breath, unable to speak. Her feet were glued to the floor. Emily approached, her steps soundless, and the closer she got, the more powerful the fear that gripped Sarah became. "Why didn't you help me?" Emily said, her voice beginning to tremble with hatred. "Why didn't you listen?" Suddenly, all the lights in the house went out, and Sarah was plunged into total darkness. Emily's laughter grew louder, mixed with sobs that echoed throughout the house. In a panic, Sarah frantically searched for the light switch, but her trembling fingers couldn't find anything. Then the cold grip returned, Emily's small hand clasping her wrist. Sarah screamed, but no sound came out. The grip tightened, and the cold spread through her body, freezing every nerve. "Why didn't you help me?" Emily's voice now became a scream filled with vengeance. "You must see what they did to me." In an instant, horrifying flashes filled Sarah's mind, blurred images of Emily being chased, tortured, and brutally murdered. But who did this to her? Why was Emily so desperate for revenge? And why had this child's spirit chosen her? In desperation, Sarah kicked backward, trying to free herself from Emily's grasp. She broke free, then ran out of the room, gasping for breath. But Emily's laughter continued to follow, echoing from every corner of the house. That night felt endless. Sarah spent the rest of it sitting in the corner of her living room, waiting for dawn. But Emily didn't return again that night. Only the remnants of her laughter and whispers continued to torment Sarah's mind. After the terrifying events in her room, Sarah could no longer stay silent. She felt trapped between fear and the obligation to uncover the truth about Emily's death. One thing was certain: something very evil had happened to that little girl, and her spirit would not rest until justice was served. Sarah decided to visit Mr. Bennet again. The old man might be the only one who could offer more answers about what really happened to Emily. She hurried to the old house at the edge of town and knocked loudly. It took a moment before Mr. Bennet appeared, looking even older and wearier than before. "You won't listen, will you?" Mr. Bennet said, his voice filled with disappointment. Sarah stared at him firmly. "Emily isn't at peace. I need to know what really happened to her." Mr. Bennet sighed deeply before finally inviting Sarah in. In the living room, filled with books and antiques, the old man sat in a rocking chair while Sarah waited anxiously. "Emily didn't die in an accident," Mr. Bennet said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "There's something darker than that. The people in this town. They know, but no one wants to speak about it." Sarah stepped closer, her heart pounding. "What are they hiding?" Mr. Bennet looked at her with a warning in his eyes. "Emily's death was the result of something evil, something done by the very people who were supposed to protect her. But they failed. Emily was betrayed, tortured, and left to die in the woods." "Who did it?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The old man remained silent for a moment before finally answering. "Some of the town's most respected people, including the community leaders at the time. They tried to cover it all up. Emily's death was ruled as an accident, but the truth is far darker." Anger mixed with fear filled Sarah. The truth about Emily's death was far more horrifying than she had ever imagined. Now, she understood why the little girl's spirit was so angry and vengeful. "How can I stop this?" Sarah asked, her eyes beginning to well up with tears. "How can I help Emily?" Mr. Bennet looked at her with a grim expression. "To help Emily, you must confront those responsible for her death. Only then can her spirit find peace. But be careful, Sarah. They'll do anything to keep this secret buried." Sarah walked home with her mind racing, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth she had just discovered. Every step she took felt like it carried an increasing burden. Mr. Bennet had revealed part of the truth, but Sarah knew he was still hiding something deeper. Who were the people responsible for Emily's death? And why were they so desperate to cover it up? That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Her eyes stared at the ceiling, her mind returning to the image of Emily, appearing in the corner of the room, begging for help. The ghost of the little girl wouldn't stop haunting her until the truth was fully revealed. But how could Sarah fight against the hidden forces in this town? How could she confront people who might still hold power? In the dead of night, Sarah suddenly heard the front door creak. Her heart raced. She knew she had locked it before going to bed, but the sound was unmistakable. With fear creeping up her spine, she got out of bed and slowly made her way to the living room. The house felt cold, and the air around her grew heavier. In the living room, the front door was slightly ajar. The night wind drifted in, causing the curtains to sway gently. Swallowing hard, Sarah looked around, and then she saw a small shadow in the mirror near the door, the shadow of a child. "Emily." Sarah froze. The figure stood still, its hollow eyes fixed on her. Her face was covered in wounds, and her lips moved as though trying to say something. But the only sound that came out was a whisper, soft yet chilling. "You have to take me home." The whisper rang clearly in Sarah's ears. Emily wanted to return to the place where she had died. Maybe that was the way to find more clues about what had happened to her. Sarah looked at the reflection in the mirror, and somehow, she knew that tonight she had to go to the forest where Emily's body was found. Breathing heavily, Sarah hurried to put on her jacket and grabbed a flashlight. This night would be long, and her fear grew with every step she took toward the woods on the outskirts of Franklin. The forest felt darker than usual, even though the moon shone brightly above. The towering trees loomed like black shadows, concealing everything beneath them. The sounds of the night began to echo, the distant hoot of an owl and the wind rustling through the leaves, creating an eerie melody that seemed to welcome her arrival. Sarah stepped carefully, her flashlight illuminating a narrow path almost hidden by grass and fallen leaves. In her mind, Emily's image haunted her. She tried to recall what Mr. Bennet had said, that people were involved in Emily's death. Had they come to this forest too? Had they done something more horrific here than she could imagine? After a while, Sarah reached an area that felt different. The air grew colder around her, and she could feel a strange sensation coursing through her body. This place. It seemed like this was where Emily had been found. She shone her flashlight in every direction, searching for any sign. But all she saw were the ruins of a small, ancient house. Its walls were crumbling, and the windows were shattered, as though the place had been abandoned for years. "This is her home," the whisper returned, clearer this time. Sarah approached the old house, and as she got closer, her steps became heavier. Her heart pounded, and every instinct screamed at her to leave, but she knew she had to keep going. Emily wanted her to find something here. The door creaked loudly as Sarah pushed it open. Inside, the room was dark and filled with dust. The damp smell clung to the air, and the floorboards groaned under her feet. Sarah shone her flashlight around, and her eyes caught something lying on the floor. A worn-out doll. It looked very old, with one eye missing and its clothes tattered. Sarah knelt, picking up the doll with trembling hands. She knew this had belonged to Emily. Suddenly, a shadow appeared in the corner of the room. Emily, her face scarred, staring at Sarah with empty eyes. The figure stepped forward, and Sarah could feel the air growing even colder. "My doll," Emily whispered. Sarah felt there was something strange about the doll. She turned it over and noticed an odd stitch along its belly. With her heart racing, she began to carefully undo the stitches. Inside, she found an old, crumpled piece of paper. It was covered in handwriting, almost too faint to read. Sarah looked at the paper in horror. It seemed to be a letter or final message from Emily before she died. The message was filled with fear and desperation, as though Emily knew her life would end tragically. But one sentence sent chills through Sarah's body. "They're going to kill me because I know their secret." Sarah felt a wave of dread wash over her. Emily wasn't just killed by chance, she had been silenced because she knew something dangerous. Something that the people of this small town, perhaps those in power, didn't want to be exposed. Suddenly, Emily's shadow, which had been standing in the corner, began to fade, leaving Sarah in a chilling silence. Yet, Sarah knew she had just uncovered an important piece of the puzzle. But the question now was, what was the secret Emily knew, and who wanted to hide it? Sarah returned home, her mind swirling with thoughts. The letter she had found in Emily's doll was a crucial key, but it wasn't enough. She needed to find out who was involved in the little girl's death. But time was running out. Emily's whispers were growing more frequent, as if her spirit was growing impatient. The next morning, Sarah decided to dig deeper into the history of Franklin and its influential people. She visited the town library, searching through old archives that might hold important information. In the section of old newspapers, she found articles discussing prominent families, and Franklin the Bennets were one of them. But one name stood out, the Hartford family. The name sounded familiar to Sarah, but she couldn't immediately place it. After digging further, she discovered that the Hartford family once held significant influence in the town, especially in politics and business. But something was odd. After Emily's death, their name gradually disappeared from the headlines, as if they had deliberately stepped out of the public eye. Sarah felt her instincts were right. The Hartford family might be involved in Emily's death, using their power to cover everything up. But how could Sarah expose them? Could she challenge them and bring the truth to light? Sarah felt that the path to the truth was becoming clearer, but it was winding and dangerous. The Hartford family was the key behind Emily's death mystery, and she had to find further evidence of their involvement. The more she dug, the darker the secrets that were revealed. On a hot day, Sarah decided to visit one of the Hartford family members still living in town, Rachel Hartford. The only daughter of the family, who now lived in seclusion in a large house at the edge of town. The house looked grand but silent, set in the middle of a vast expanse of land and surrounded by a rusted iron fence. Despite feeling tense, Sarah knew she had no other choice. Rachel might have the answers she had been searching for all along. When she knocked on the large door of the house, there was a pause that felt like forever before the door finally creaked open. Rachel appeared behind the door, an elderly woman who looked weary and full of secrets. Her face was pale, and her sharp green eyes scrutinized Sarah with suspicion. "What do you want?" Rachel's voice was cold. Sarah swallowed hard, trying to calm herself. "I want to know about Emily's death. I know your family is involved. I just want to find the truth." Rachel's expression shifted slightly, but she quickly returned to a stiff demeanor. She stared at Sarah for a moment before opening the door wider and allowing Sarah to enter. "Follow me." The house was large and filled with antiques. The atmosphere felt heavy and gloomy, as if something lurked behind the walls. Rachel led Sarah to a spacious but dark living room filled with old furniture and thick curtains that blocked out sunlight. As they sat down, Rachel stared at Sarah with eyes full of guilt. "Emily's death is something that can never be fixed," Rachel began in a quiet but steady voice. "There's a lot you don't know about my family, about what happened to Emily. But you must understand, there's a price to pay for the truth." Sarah felt her throat dry. "What do you mean?" Rachel took a deep breath. "My family. They are not what people think. There was a deal made years ago, a dark pact involving power and secrets. Emily. She saw something she wasn't supposed to see. Something involving my father and some influential people in this town. They did something evil, and Emily inadvertently became a witness." Sarah held her breath, feeling her heart race faster. "What did Emily see?" Rachel shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. something that should have remained hidden. My family, they performed rituals. Rituals to maintain their power and influence in this town. My father was the leader of all this. Emily witnessed the ritual, and they had no choice but to silence her. Sarah felt dizzy. Ritual? Dark power? Was this all real? For a moment, she found it hard to believe all of this, but seeing the sincerity on Rachel's face, she knew there was truth behind her words. Franklin had long been ruled by influential families who not only abused power but also something much darker and older. Emily knew they would kill her, Rachel continued, her voice trembling. That's why she wrote that letter. She hoped someone would find it and reveal the truth. But they were too powerful, and they covered everything up. Sarah felt her blood run cold. The more she listened, the more she realized she had stepped into a mystery far larger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. So, you know everything? And you did nothing. Rachel looked down, appearing tormented by guilt. I was afraid. I was just a child then, and by the time I grew up, it was too late. My family. They were too deep in it, and I didn't know how to change anything. The tension in the room increased, and Sarah knew time was running out. So, what now? Is there any way to stop this? Rachel looked at her with a weary expression. The only way to stop it is to reveal the truth. But that means you have to fight against them all. The people in this town, they won't let you go easily. They will do anything to protect their secrets. Sarah knew she could not turn back. Emily needed justice, and although it was dangerous, she had to push forward. But how could she confront the Hartford family and those involved in this dark conspiracy? Rachel stood up and handed Sarah something, a small wooden box that looked very old. This might help you, she said in a serious tone. This box contains evidence that might be enough to uncover everything. But be careful, Sarah. They will come after you after this. Sarah took the box with trembling hands. She knew tonight would be her last night in Franklin, at least while she was safe. The Hartford family and everyone involved would know she had found something very dangerous. But she had no other choice. Emily deserved justice. That night, Sarah packed quickly. She knew her time in Franklin was almost up. She turned on a small lamp on the table, gazing at the wooden box Rachel had given her. Her fingers moved slowly, opening the lid. Inside were some old-looking photos and documents. The photos depicted figures involved in the strange ritual witnessed by Emily, including Mr. Bennett, Rachel's father, and several other important people in the town. The documents were real evidence of the dark pact made by the city's elites, and Emily had inadvertently become entangled in it. Sarah stared at the documents with a mix of fear and anger. How could the people who were supposed to protect the community do such vile things? A knock on the door startled her. Sarah turned quickly, sensing a strange chill enveloping the room. The knocking grew louder, and Sarah knew they had arrived. Breathless, Sarah rushed out through the back window. She ran through the night, carrying the wooden box with her. She had to get out of this town, but she also had to ensure that this truth reached the right hands. There was no other way. Emily had been trapped in the shadows for too long, and now it was time for the world to know the truth behind her tragic death. In the distance, Sarah heard the sound of approaching cars. They were chasing her. But Sarah would not stop. She ran through the dark forest, with only a flashlight and fear as her companions. The night grew darker, and around her, Emily's whispers continued to echo. "Take me home. Take me home." Sarah knew that the little girl would never find peace until all this was over. The dark secrets of Franklin have now been revealed, and Sarah carries evidence that could uncover the truth. However, powerful forces are hunting her down. Can Sarah save herself and expose the truth behind Emily's death? Are you brave enough to face the darkness and seek justice for Emily? The truth always comes with a price. Get ready, for this journey has only just begun.